Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Fire These Times. I am Ayoub, and I'll be one of your two hosts today. I'm a researcher, writer, stay-at-home dad, human to two dogs, and I like to talk about weird things like solar punk, anarchism, feminism, and why I think it's a bad idea to have fascists take over the power of the state. I'm a reluctant academic. I mostly work on memory, hauntings, and temporalities in places like Lebanon, Syria, and Israel-Palestine. I also really hate the advertising industry, which is completely irrelevant to this conversation, but I just wanted to bring it up anyway. And I think that the vast majority of business schools and economics departments are full of shit, which is why I'm also an associate fellow of the Post-Growth Institute. I am currently still extremely angry that the 9-month-long genocide continues to take place in Gaza, with the complicity of Western and Arab governments, a genocide obviously by the Israeli state, as well as the complicity of academic, media, and other institutions, all throughout the West and the Arab world, among others. And same goes for the ongoing genocide in Sudan, for that matter, with the complicity of Russia and another shitty government, the UAE. Before we begin this episode, which is going to be on the history of the Olympics and why it matters that we pay attention to the Olympics, especially the politics behind it, I want to remind everyone that the Fire These Times is part of the From the Periphery Media Collective, which you can support on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery and get early access to the Fire These Times episode, as well as from the podcasts such as Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, Keep This Between Us, and much more to come. You will also get an invitation to join our monthly hangout, weekly Palestine watch parties, early access to our first upcoming zine, our first upcoming book club, and much more. For everything else, visit thefirethisetimes.com as well as fromtheperiphery.com. So the Paris Olympics are starting today. We're releasing this episode on July 26th. And they have been controversial from the start. They're expected to cost billions of euros, which obviously folks are not very happy with. Paris itself is expected to be much more congested than it currently is. Gérard Darmanin, the interior minister accused by at least 2 women of sexual harassment and who has quoted the far right with his racism and transphobia, is the person responsible for putting this together. He's also the guy, by the way, who allowed football fans during the 2022 Champions League final in France to be assaulted with tear gas. Qualities that you want, I'm sure, in the guy who's also responsible for the Olympics. In October 2023, France's own financial prosecutors raided Paris 2024 Olympics headquarters on suspicion of, quote, illegal taking of interest, favoritism, and concealment, end quote, in the award of several contracts. Lovely. In April of this year, migrants from several makeshift camps in Paris were, quote unquote, socially cleansed as part of the attempts to beautify the city and remove its unwanted residents who may inconvenience tourists and athletes with their poverty. To make things worse, France, in its ongoing obsession with controlling what racialized women get to do with their bodies, has banned French athletes who wear the hijab from the Olympics, unless they, of course, stop wearing the hijab, effectively barring many Muslim athletes from competing. Athletes from genocidal countries such as Azerbaijan and Israel are also going to participate and represent their countries, while other governments that are also genocidal, such as the Russian and Belarusian one, will have their athletes allowed to participate as quote-unquote individual neutral athletes, at least at the time of recording, which is July 15th. These are just scratching the surface. And yet, despite all of this, we are going to witness a spectacle which purports to be all about universalism, fairness, and other nice buzzwords. This is not new with the Olympics, certainly not with the current Olympics. It's an event which, may be surprising to many, has a long history of being problematic and troubling as fuck. We will be focusing on a couple of events that took place in 1936, the Nazi one, which I'm sure you've heard of, and the anti-fascist one in Barcelona, which you probably have not, the 1936 Popular Olympics in Barcelona, which among other things produced very cool posters that I want to print and hang in my house. Here with us to talk about all of that is James Stout, author of the book The Popular Front and the Barcelona 1936 Popular Olympics, and one of the hosts of It Could Happen Here, part of Cool Zone Media, which, by the way, I'm subscribed to, and you should be as well. James, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm good. It's Monday morning. I'm excited for another week here. Spent the weekend watching people have insane conspiracy theories about the attempted Donald Trump assassination. So it's been a normal one.
Yeah, I followed some of those as well. Some of those are quite wild. Can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I too am a sort of reluctant, maybe a lapsed academic. I too think the econ department is full of shit, which we share that. But yeah, I am a journalist. I'm an anarchist, and I am a person who has studied anti-fascism, popular frontism, and the Spanish Civil War for a lot of my life. I wrote this book that you mentioned, which arose from my dissertation, which looked at the construction of an anti-fascist Catalan identity in the Spanish Second Republic and the consequences for that in the very early part. And we're talking like the first month of the Spanish Civil War. Really, the first week of the Spanish Civil War is my shit. And because of that, and my current work at Cool Zone Media, where I'm a journalist covering conflict and migration, I'm writing another book about anarchists at war, which will draw on some experiences I've had in Rojava and also with the rebels in Myanmar. And that will be done when it's done, which hopefully is soon, but that'll be with AK Press. In addition to all those things, I spent a lot of time doing mutual aid at the border between the United States and Mexico, where, as people may or may not be aware, we've seen record deaths every year in the Biden administration. Despite his change in rhetoric from the Trump administration, there hasn't been a change in policy, really. And so my friends and I try and help make the border a little less cruel and a little less deadly.
Thanks for that, James. And also joining us today is our co-host, Aiden from Antidote Zine and from the Periphery. Aiden, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, all. My name is Aiden. I am a co-editor of Antidote Zine, antidotezine.com, which is an anarchist storytelling outlet. We uplift stories from the periphery in a way. We transmit, translate, and transcribe different grassroots movement histories, people's histories, analyses about stories of resistance in places of the world that often get overlooked, and people who are often sidelined by mainstream media. We do this in a long form way. So the point is to kind of dig deep into people's stories. We focus often on the Mediterranean Circle, but have been expanding a little bit more to where we're based in Minneapolis and Turtle Island more broadly. And I'm very happy to be here today with you, James. I am also personally a former athlete. I played semi-professional soccer or football for the Europeans, and also played rugby in college. And sports have been a big and important part of my life, but also something that I have since left behind. And find the topic of mega events, so to speak, like the Olympics, fascinating and extremely challenging to engage with. So excited to dig into the history of that more and point people toward other resources about it as well.
Yeah, I will probably at some point we'll see in this conversation talk about my own kind of personal relationship with sports is basically football or soccer for the Americans, and the World Cup and the Euro and Copa America mostly. It's a big deal in Lebanon, but we'll see if we can get into that later. And kind of to kick us off with a bit of a sarcastic question to both of you, how excited are you by the Paris Olympics on a scale of like very to a lot to very, 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 and why is that?
I guess I'll go first. I'm always excited to talk about the Olympics, because I've spent a lot of my life studying it. I don't think the IOC is my biggest fan, and I think that is a feeling that I share for them. But it's always such a troubled thing. Like I remember I was an athlete too. I raced bikes in Europe. That was my job for some of my younger years. And like, it is this thing that you always aspire to as an athlete. And then you become aware as you become a person that like it is extremely problematic and extremely damaging to the communities it takes part in. So I know, like I'm always excited to see like the boundaries of human performance pushed. That's cool, but I also it's like this thing that you know is bad for you. It's like drinking. Like you're going to feel bad afterwards. And so in that sense, I would rather there is a better model that we'll talk about, and I'd rather we were doing that.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I haven't watched the Olympics in years. I think I was pretty very, very disillusioned to hear as I grew into adulthood about just all of the ways that surrounding the Olympics and preparing for the Olympics. And, the World Cup is the same, where communities are just completely fucked over by all of the preparations that happen. And especially any signs of poverty are just completely kicked out of city centers. And um, yeah, it's hard to sort of enjoy anything that has that shadow. And at the same time, um, watching weird people do really weird random sports that I've never heard of really well is it's fun, it's fascinating. It's cool to see like people coming from all parts of the world to get together to do those things and to do them really well. But at what cost? I mean, that just makes it really hard to engage with personally, as much as I love watching sports. Elia, how do you feel about the upcoming Olympics?
I don't care about that. I don't know. I haven't. I used to. I watched. I definitely watched some of the London ones. I remember at the time, and when I was younger, I watched the ones in Beijing, I believe, and definitely it's in China. And I remember being mesmerized by, well, the Beijing one especially, and the London ones to some extent. But that was just because of like the. I was. I still am to some extent, like fascinated by just the spectacle of like what do they choose to put on the stage on that opening night. The Chinese one was very much like, we're an ancient civilization and whatnot, and then the British one was like Mr. Bean and
the British one you could do. I'm sure someone has done a dissertation on the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympics.
Yeah.
I think I may have read it, but yeah, fascinating to see how we portrayed ourselves to the world.
Exactly. It is like the founding of the NHS, which I think if they do it now, this wouldn't actually appear in the Olympic ceremony.
Yeah, we fucked it.
Exactly. And there's 007 and the Queen, just a bunch of and Paddington, and just stuff that like for someone like me who grew up with, at least there was a lot of like UK and American TV in the background, or at least or like in our daily life. It was kind of like seeing all of the fictional stuff meet the real stuff. It's interesting from that perspective. Let's put it that way. But yeah, as I said, I do follow football from time to time, more of the international stuff than the clubs. And in Lebanon, the World Cup especially is a pretty massive cultural event. It kind of mobilizes, like the entire country kind of shuts down effectively when there's the World Cup. So I have some fond memories based on that in terms of like just personal stories and going to someone's house and shit like that. And the family building having a ridiculously gigantic Argentina flag outside, which is embarrassing, but that was the case. So there is a bit of that. So that I guess I have a bit more of an emotional resonance when it comes to the World Cup than the Olympics. My father-in-law is really into the Olympics, so that's like a conversation we can have, him and I, from time to time. But I only do that to have a conversation with him more than anything. Yeah, let's get into the history. Aiden, I think you were going to ask the first one.
Yeah. So, as we mentioned, and as we'll continue to refer back to, James, you've studied very deeply the 1936 Popular Olympics, which is something that a lot of folks listening might not know about. It's lesser known than the other Olympics that happened around that time. And these Popular Olympics were meant to take place in Barcelona. Athletes from all over the world traveled there, but it didn't end up happening for a very important reason. You did a 2-part deep dive on this history on cool people who did cool stuff, which we'll link to in the episode notes. People should definitely check that out if they want to get the long version of this story. But for our listeners, especially kind of with the Paris Olympics right in view, we'd love if you could give us a sort of brief overview of the Popular Olympics in 1936 and just kind of the history leading up to that, anything that you feel is important to mention about how the Olympics came to be.
Yeah, so I'll do a potted version of a course I used to teach here, which, as an academic, I'm very given to just bloviating, but I'll try not to do that. I think to understand the Olympics, you have to understand, here, I'm off now. To understand the Olympics, you have to understand sport, right? And to understand sport, you have to understand the difference between play and sport, right? people have played for as long as there have been people, right? We see these proto sports. Probably the best examples are folk football matches, which used to take place in England on Saints' days, right, or holy days. People would take the day off, they'd inflate a giant pig's bladder, and they'd try and kick it from one village to the next with very few rules. Like, people would get stabbed. People would have like shields and form like a little phalanx to take the ball in. Really, not what we expect from football today, right? But this is play. There are other forms of play, right? Like I want to emphasize that as a British person, we don't always stab each other when we're playing. But this is sort of an unruly and ungoverned form of play. When we get sport, we take play and we constrain it, right, within a space and within a set of rules. We have a playing field now. You can't go anywhere. You can't take it on a 2-mile excursion to get to the other team's church, right? Generally have to get it to the church, the other village. Instead, we have a playing field and you can't leave that. And now you can't stab people and now you can't pick up the ball. And we have all these different rules that we place on it to constrain it. To understand where that sporting impulse comes from, I think you have to understand British colonialism, which I do not have time to explain. Really, very few of us have enough time in our lives to explain. But
you can explain British colonialism in like 10 seconds, James?
Yeah, sure. It's based in, I guess, racism and stealing stuff from
there you go.
colonial periphery. So in the core of the British Empire, right, the metropole, we have these public schools, which are not actually public. You have to pay to attend them. We like to confuse people with our language. And so these schools exist to turn out officers for the empire, right? Both bureaucrats and military officers. The way that these schools create people who fit a model which is called muscular Christianity, right? The idea that they are strong, healthy, fit, and are morally strong according to Christian principles, or what are seen as Christian principles. Sport plays a key part in that. And if we're looking for a specific individual who embodies this ideology, we can look at Thomas Arnold, right? The headmaster of the rugby school. People will think, is the school named after the game or is the game named after the school? The game is named after the school. Rugby has a foundation myth, much like, Rome has the twins and the wolf and like lots of other like things have a foundation myth, right? Rugby does too. This kid called William Webb Ellis, with a glorious disregard for the rules. There's a statue of him, right? Picked up and ran with the ball. And as such, it took football and created rugby. I guess this is somewhat ludicrous, right? Like obviously people had thought of picking up balls before some kid with a double-barreled surname at a public school did it. But nonetheless, this is how it tells its own history. So we have sport, right, emerging at the end of the 19th century as a way to get people to obey the rules, keep them fit, to teach them respect for authority, and just to somewhat sort of inculcate them with obeying the rules during a stressful situation, right? And certainly sports used to be a little more stressful in a sense than they are now, right? Like a little more violent than they are now. And it constrains violence and gives it a place to come out, right? Especially with these contact sports, right? And I'm talking about here in the participation. We could argue that a similar thing happens in spectating. Elias and Dunning talk about the civilizing process. It's a good book if you want to read it. This is happening at the end of the 19th century, and it has a great influence on a man called Pierre de Coubertin, right, who's the founder of the modern Olympic movement. At the same time, like if you look at the architecture at that time, we see neoclassical architecture, right? There's a big fascination with returning to these classical civilizations, being Greece and Rome. And one of the things that de Coubertin picks out of his he's an aristocrat, right? He's been educated. Actually, he had a very interesting education that wasn't exactly sort of conventional. He had what would be seen as a progressive education for his era. And he's interested in returning to some of these classical principles. And one of the things he finds is the Olympic Games. The idea that people would come together across various Greek city-states. There's this fictive notion of an Olympic truce where they would stop fighting while the games took place. That's not entirely true. It's more like the people taking part in the games have safe passage to get to the games rather than everyone just stops their wars, right? So in these Olympic Games, people will come together and do these various activities, right, as a way to honor the gods. it's very interesting to look at these proto-Olympian or like these Greek classical Olympic games. Like we see many elements of the modern Olympics to include doping, right? Like all these athletes trying to get an edge on each other however they can. De Coubertin takes this and uses it as a foundation myth for the modern Olympic Games. I think the best way to see the modern Olympic Games as de Coubertin founded them is a gathering of the transnational bourgeoisie. That's not my phrase. I'm borrowing it from my friend David Goldblatt, who wrote a book called The Games. It's an excellent book. It's not unnecessarily academic and boring. You can even get it as an audiobook, actually. And I would highly recommend it for anyone looking to study the history of the Olympics. So Pierre de Coubertin creates this thing, right? And in its early years, the Olympics are extremely tied to World's Fairs. World's Fairs are extremely tied to colonialism, right? It's when we get together in the colonial core to exhibit the booty that we've extracted from the colonial periphery, in a sense, right? And so we see the Olympics happening as part of this. To give an example of how tied to colonialism the Olympics would be the 1904 St. Louis Olympics. So if people aren't familiar, they had what are called the anthropological games, when they just kidnapped people from colonized places, brought them to the colonial cores, metropolis, right? And then kind of vaguely explained the events to them and made them compete against people from the metropolis. So it's social Darwinism baked into a sports event, right? This is happening in 1904. We have other events too. Famously, the 1904 and 1908 marathon are, I think, perhaps best described as a massive clusterfuck. But at the time, people were abstaining from food and water during their marathon runs. So we have these incredible events where like people run 25 miles and then have a glass of champagne for the last mile, immediately vomit, have convulsions. In the 1908 Olympics, the Italian runner entered the stadium and set off running the wrong way around the track, and then collapsed several times and was assisted by officials in standing up and pointing in the right direction, like literally, 100 meters from the finish. And eventually wins, but is disqualified for having received outside assistance, right? And the gold medal is awarded to an American runner, but then the Queen herself awards him with his own medal and parade. So he's paraded through London as kind of the people's champion. So at this time, like, knowledge of endurance sports was not, it was more about character than physical preparation, right? So the Olympics, as this gathering of the transnational bourgeoisie, grows in the early part of the 20th century, right? It's also very tied still to this idea of creating a colonial officer, right? If we're familiar with modern pentathlon, we can see like the events that take place in a modern pentathlon, like riding a horse, fencing, running, swimming, and shooting. General Patton competed in the modern pentathlon, right? I've read a couple of sources where they have to shoot pistols at a target. That's part of this. They were unable to determine the size of his grouping of shots because he used such a large pistol that he just eviscerated like the target. Like he had this like hand cannon, which is very American. So we're creating these colonial officers with these little games, right? But it's tied to a sort of liberal notion of colonialism, I would say. And that sort of maybe somewhat paternalistic notion of colonialism. Let's go forward to 1931. 1931, what's happening in Spain is that the dicta blanda, the soft dictatorship, the Primo de Rivera dictatorship is collapsing. So is the monarchy, and the Second Republic is coming into being, right? At the exact same time this is happening, the International Olympic Committee is meeting in Barcelona. It's worth noting that countries are not represented. National committees, national organizing committees are represented at the IOC, right? And at this time, most of the people on the IOC are aristocrats. A few of them are bourgeois. Many of them are titled nobility, right? They're meeting at a time when Spain is doing away with its monarchy, right? And like Barcelona is a place where churches have burned before, where there is a very prominent anarchist movement in 1931, right? In 1932, the subsequent year, like they're declaring libertarian communism in the Alt Llobregat, and whole towns are abolishing money and declaring themselves to be anarchist communes, right? So the anarchism is more present here than arguably anywhere else on earth at this time. And a vote takes place on where to hold the 1936 Olympics, right? This is how the IOC, they still do this today, right? They decide where to hold the games. Not everyone is able to be present in Barcelona, but most of the IOC members are, right? It's 1931, so travel isn't easy. They take a vote. Then they take another vote afterwards by telegram. And it seems that the second vote is the binding vote. Taking a second vote is very unusual. I can't find... Now, they say there wasn't quorum, right? If you look at the justification for this, there aren't enough people for the vote to count. There were other votes which had fewer participants, so I'm not buying the quorum line. This is something that I did after my book that I'm kind of interested in, but not interested enough to pursue it further. I went and looked. So they take this vote by telegram, and the telegram vote elects, instead of the unstable Spain, they opt for a stable, modern European democracy, right? And the one they choose is Weimar Germany. Now, people who are familiar with 20th century history will realize that they done fucked up there. And what happens is that the IOC, it's my belief that they re-voted because they wanted to not give it to Republican Spain, right? With these aristocrats. And so the IOC awards the games to Nazi Germany. At first, when the Nazis come to power, they don't want the games. Actually, they see it as kind of part of this grand, Jewish liberal conspiracy, Bolshevism, blah blah blah, right? All the things that Nazis like to say. But over time, the people who are responsible for the Olympics, both of whom would be categorized as Jewish by the Nazis, according to their ancestry and their marriage. Karl Diem, one of them. Karl Diem is kind of the mastermind of the 36 Olympics, and to a degree, the modern Olympics, is married to a Jewish lady. What they come to believe is that they can use this Olympics to do their own fictive founding myth. Many of the things that we see in the modern Olympics, right, the torch relay, the parade of nations, the Olympic medal table, come right really out of 36. Some of them start in 32, but certainly things like the torch relay, that's a 36 thing. Coming from ancient Greece to Nazi Germany is an invention of this period, right? And it is deliberately drawing a link through history, through time, from one to the other, right? These great civilizing powers. And that's a very conscious effort. Now, it won't have escaped listeners' attention that not everybody was welcome in Nazi Germany, right? And by 1936, it was extremely clear that this was a state that was deeply invested in homophobia, in a violent persecution of the left, in anti-Semitism, in persecution of traveling peoples, right, and in many other genocidal projects. What the people of the world who don't like fascism, right, broadly speaking, the Popular Front. Popular Front is a specific term, right? It comes out of the Communist International, this idea that we can't go so hard for revolution that we piss off the liberals. They learned this from what happens in Germany in 1933, right? We can't have this three-way fight right now. We can't have communism, liberalism, and fascism, because the liberals will hate us more than they hate the fascists. This is a thing that is true. People will have seen this many times over human history with various left groups, right? So they decide to push this alliance between socialists, left liberals, and communists, and this is called the Popular Front, right? You can read more about this. I've written a book about it, but this is a very potted history. And so in the spirit of the Popular Front, the Catalan Republican left, right, the ERC, as it's called, literally means Republican Left of Catalonia in Catalan, the party that has governed the Catalan autonomous region since 1931 without break. Well, it had a small break when it tried to declare autonomy in 1934. Did not succeed. Spain also has a Popular Front government, right? We don't have time to go into the history of the Spanish Second Republic, but basically, if you imagine it swings from left to right every 2 years, we're in a left swing right now, and it has a Popular Front government. Catalonia has a Popular Front government, so we're aligned. France has a Popular Front government. A conference takes place in Paris in April of 1936, International Conference for Respect for the Olympic Ideal. I don't think that the Olympic ideal is what they are saying it was, but that's I respect what they were going for, I guess. They're like, the Olympics is for everyone. We can't give it to these bigots. We'll do our own Olympics. Barcelona had all the stadia in place, right? Because it had applied for the 36 Olympics and it had previously had a World's Fair. So they're using the facilities from the World's Fair. And the Catalans, it's worth noting as well that Catalonia had a National Olympic Committee in addition to Spain, because if you spent more than like one day in Catalonia, you'll understand why. But Catalans love to be having independent institutions, and I understand that when Spain's institutions were being really shitty. So the Catalans say, yeah, we're ready. We'll take it. We'll go. And so from April to July, they begin frantically organizing what becomes the Popular Olympics. You'll sometimes see this translated as People's Olympics. I think that it was called Olimpiada Popular, which the reason it's called that is because it's the same word as the word for the Popular Front. And when we translate Frente Popular into English, we don't translate it as People's Front. Some people do, but generally it's translated as Popular Front. And the idea is to embody the Popular Front in these popular games. That's why I translate it that way. So the Popular Olympics is cobbled together over the next few months it's really kind of like, obviously it is something of a state project, but it's also has this kind of vaguely punk kind of vibe to it, where like they're going around people's houses, and I've seen these little pieces of paper in the archives, right? And they're like, okay, how many spare beds do you have? Okay, you have 2 spare beds. Are they in their own room or are they in a communal room? Sweet. Can you also give people breakfast? Nice. Okay, you can accommodate 2 athletes, and we'll compensate you like X per night and pay you for the food you use. So they don't have enough hotel rooms, right? So people are staying with people. They work with the unions to ensure free passage on trains, right? So people can pass all through France on unionized trains for free to get to Barcelona, where they can then board a unionized train or bus, and then get to the border, right? And then they board a unionized train or bus, and that gets them to Barcelona. So it's just very, it embodies what the Olympic ideal should be, this fictive myth of the Olympics, right? And they go a long way in this. They are absolutely invested in it being a project for all races, genders, identities, religions, etc. Right? If we look at their poster art, we see, like, there's one on my wall here. The people are depicted, like various races of people are depicted in the poster art, which is not a thing that people did casually in 1936. They also allow people to compete as nations rather than states, right? So Catalonia, the Basque Country, the exiled Jews of Europe, right? The Jewish Workers' Sports Club competed. The women students of the world competed. The colonized people competed under their identities, not the identities of their colonizer. And this was obviously a big middle finger to kind of this colonial project that the Olympics have become. And I think they knew that. They were also extremely invested in women's sport, right? And we see Marina Ginesta, if you've seen one picture of the Spanish Civil War, it's the lady with the Mauser standing on the roof smiling at the camera, right? She was a hurdler. She was a very good hurdler. She probably would have competed in the Popular Olympics, right? Another thing we see at the Popular Olympics to allow more people to compete is different levels. We have elite, provincial, and then amateur sports, right? So you can compete as an elite athlete. And it's worth noting that these workers' athletes would normally running faster, jumping higher, being stronger than the athletes who competed in the Olympic Games, because the Olympic Games had this ethos of amateurism. Amateurism is essentially, it's a class barrier, right? If you get paid to do your sport, then you can't come to the Olympic Games. Amateurism comes out of England, and it comes specifically out of this idea that it's inappropriate for working class people to be kicking that shit out of bourgeois people, right? So like, if we say that you can't leave because what you would have would be like factory teams, right? And the factory owner would just get people in and they wouldn't have to work. They just pay them to play football for the prestige of their factory or what have you. That is prohibited. You can't compete if you're a professional. That's how we see rugby union and rugby league split in England, right? And the Olympics is the same. And we can see this professionalism wielded as a race barrier. Like if we look at the case of Jim Thorpe, Tom Longboat, right? Like indigenous people from Turtle Island being excluded, in some cases disqualified after their participation, right? In the case of Jim Thorpe, who was a sack and fox. enrolled member, and incredible athlete, incredible decathlete, incredible. He went on to have a baseball, and I think a football career. Jim Thorpe also wrote a history of the Olympics, which is a thing lots of people don't know. But what's really fucked is that he was so invested in this Olympic ideal, and then it bit him in the ass, right? But I found his book I found his correspondence as well in the Olympic archive in Lausanne. It's really sad to see it. But incredible guy, incredible athlete. So this isn't the case in Barcelona, right? There is no amateurism restriction. These are all working people. We also have some bourgeois people who are just bourgeois and anti-fascist. Perhaps they're also Jewish, right? They ain't going to Germany to justify the Nazi regime. And so we have this Olympiad, which is very much about what the Olympic ideal maybe should be or what they felt it should be. To emphasize this, they have things like the mass relay races on the first day, 10 by 50 meters, right? So and you can't only have runners. So you've got like wrestlers, swimmers, gymnasts running in this massive relay race, right? It's kind of have the school sports day vibe. And the idea is that the nation which has the healthiest working population will prevail, as opposed to the nation with a couple of freak athletes. And a lot of the working class sport movement, the popular sport movement, which had been built in Catalonia since 1931, was explicitly about the health of the working class, the damage that factory work did to them, and specifically things like tuberculosis, preventing tuberculosis, right? Creating a healthier working class. By 36, this isn't just about healthier working class. It's about a stronger working class. It's about bringing anti-fascists together while fascism is doing its spectacle in Berlin and being like, we are strong, we are fast. Like, if you want to fight us, you can come. Like, there were boxing was a big part of the Popular Olympics, right? So it's showing the muscle of anti-fascism, and it does this in various ways, explicitly and implicitly. They also had, as many Olympiads did in the early 20th century, a cultural Olympiad, right? Chess was a big part of the Popular Olympics. Pétanque, boule. There's an American word for it. I don't know what the Americans call it.
Yeah,
when you have a little,
but I know what pétanque is. Yeah, it's big in Marseille.
Yeah. You have a little ball and you throw it into a big pit of sand, and then you throw some larger, heavier balls and try and get near it.
Bocce? Is that bocce?
Yes, that's it. Yeah. Bocce, yeah. So that takes part, but also things like you have traditional folk dance, you have Catalan gigants, right? Like these kind of giant, I don't know, like humanoid, they're human, they're like giants, but they're made of papier-mâché, and they use them in parades and in traditional ceremonies. You have castels, right, the human towers that the Catalans famously form, right? But then there are also bagpipers and Highland dancers from Scotland, right? There are traditional dancers from Galicia. There are people from all over the world coming to exhibit. There's a writing event at the Cultural Olympics, right? Like there's a painting. So all of these things are supposed to come together to be this festival of the largest anti-fascist spectacle the world has ever seen, is what they called it, right? And that's what it was. But we can get into this more deeply, I guess. The night before the Olympics, the way I would tell it, the way I tell it in my book, is at Pau Casals. People of Pablo Casals, maybe they know him as, right, depending on Catalan or Spanish. He's like the father of modern cello music. He has composed the hymn to the Popular Olympics, and he wrote the music, and then an exiled German Jewish lyricist wrote the lyrics. And so the idea was it was this sort of Catalonia meets anti-fascism, right? They're rehearsing that the day before when someone busts in and it's like, hey, there's been an uprising. Casals then decides to finish the rehearsal, right? They play the Ode to Joy, Beethoven, and then they all leave and go to their homes and don't see each other again, maybe ever. Many of them die, right? 20,000 people had shown up for the Popular Olympics. It would have been a huge spectacle. Many of them have come because they are anti-fascists. And when they see the Spanish military in the streets fighting the Spanish people, there's that famous Orwell quote, when I see a real flesh and blood worker in conflict with his natural enemy, the policeman, I never have to ask myself what side I'm on. These guys have that same reaction, right? Many of them don't share language, but they've been there for a week, and you can read in their diaries, right? The American team I've written about extensively. I can link you to some pieces, but their coaches have trouble keeping them out of the nightclubs and bars because they're like, there's a real feeling of revolution in Barcelona in 1936. There's a real feeling of the people in command, even before the coup, because everyone knows the coup is coming, and they're not afraid. They're prepared, right? And so when the coup comes, the people go into the streets and they start crowbarring up the paving stones, like you can see in the Rambla today, right? And they start making barricades. And these popular Olympians, so we see, for instance, Charlie Burley, right? Charlie Burley is a biracial boxer from Pittsburgh. He's supposed to be one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world, but he doesn't want to go to Berlin. He declines. He wants to go to Barcelona, right? He's there. He doesn't speak Spanish, but he gets down and starts building barricades, right, with the Spanish people. You can see others of them, like Bernie Danchik, who's a Jewish gymnast. He keeps popping out onto his balcony to check out what's going on, and keeps getting shot at because people think he's a sniper. So in the end, they pop out with like a thing like, "We're Americans," and then they claim that no one shot them after that. But in the weeks that follow, before we had the international parade, we had centuria, right? Groups of 100 people. And these centuria sometimes got together in columns, like the Durruti column being the most famous example, the Ascaso column. These international groups within the different columns, the international centuria, are formed often of popular Olympians, right? Of people who had no intention of joining a war when they came, but they came as anti-fascists and they stayed as anti-fascists. And I trace some of their legacies in the book, right? Some of these different anti-fascists, some were socialist, some were liberal, some were communist, some were anarchist. All of them hated fascism. And so when they see the army come into the streets of Barcelona and they see the people defeat the army in the streets, it's this amazing spectacle, right? You have like, in one example, you have news workers rolling out like huge, like several meter wide rolls of paper that they use to print the newspapers on, and using these as a rolling barricade. So they're like hiding behind them, firing from behind them, and then rolling them forward, firing from behind them. Like it's this incredible spectacle of like the people in arms. And many of the popular Olympians elect to stay. Some go home, and like Al Chaikin, who I've written about a lot, someone, I don't know, I can find some common ground with, who was also a community college lecturer, was also like a former athlete who like bust his body so much he couldn't compete anymore. Also, obviously an anti-fascist. He came home and couldn't deal with being away, so he went back. He gave speeches, he raised money, he didn't feel like he was doing enough, so he went back, and he dies in the retreats later. Many of these popular Olympians die, right, because they are international troops, are often used as shock troops in the Spanish Civil War. But yeah, that is the hopefully not too lengthy sort of link from, I guess, British folk football to the 1936 Popular Olympics.
That was brilliant. Thanks, James. There's a quote that you mentioned. Okay, you have a quote in your National Geographic piece, which we'll link up in the thingy in the show notes, which is in a few short hours, anti-fascism went from an idea to an action to resounding victory in the Catalan capital. The coup was defeated for the moment, but there would be no popular Olympics. And then you add the Spanish Civil War had begun, and I would guess, and obviously please correct me if I'm wrong, that like you would have spent some time thinking of like this, the big what ifs of history, like what if it had gone through, what if also like it was actually as popular, if not more popular than the much more infamous and famous Olympics in Berlin. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like what kind of, I'm not necessarily asking you to predict an entirely parallel universe here, but what are some of the things that you think could have been more possible, let's say, than were, because they were effectively crushed in that moment in many ways?
Yeah, it allows us to build, like if you look at the popular Olympians, the ones who survived the Second World War, right? They spend their whole lives advocating for getting rid of Franco by any means necessary, right? It gave us a popular frontism that wasn't basically Soviet communism exported. Right, you can see so many of the people sent by communist parties. So many of them struggle so deeply with the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. Right, some of them leave, some of them remain, but are very deeply troubled by it. Right, and like there was an option for an anti-fascism there, which was rooted in basic decency, respect for other people, and a repudiation of everything that fascism stands for, without standing for another totalitarian regime or being a tool for it, right? That, I think, dies. It dies in 1937 in Barcelona, to my mind, right? When the Republic sends its troops to fight against its own people, against the anarchists who have unionized a telephone exchange, among other things, right? Anarchists and the POUM, who are non-Stalinist Marxists. And it dies with the anarchists that the Spanish military intelligence service arrests, tortures, and kills throughout the Civil War, right? Who had more to fear. The SIM, Servicio Inteligencia Militar, spends more time going after anarchists than it does after actual fascists. So I think there is a potential for something there. I also think it gives us potentially, like, if the Spanish Civil War had happened a few months later, and this spectacle had occurred, the possibility of the quote unquote democracies, right, in the colonial core intervening, it's not there. Even if they had just stopped their companies selling oil, right? If Texaco had not sold oil to the Francoists, the Spanish Civil War would have been a very different affair. Or if we had actually kept the non-intervention pact and stopped Germany and Italy intervening. But at first, France, we actually see, like, in the weeks before the Popular Olympics, France is hosting these big fundraisers in stadiums in Paris, and like we see this massive real solidarity, right? And the French are the most numerous volunteers in the Spanish Civil War who are not Spanish, right? But if the French Popular Front had built those links even stronger through the Popular Olympics, right, and then intervened in Spain, then we see a very different future, right? Because we see everything that's going to happen in the Second World War happening in Spain. The Nazis develop all their tactics, right? It's from, we see the bombing of Guernica, but also things like these 88 millimeter guns that they used in all kinds of interesting, like, direct fire, and like they honed all that in Spain. You can read about it in it's very interesting to see the anarchists of the Durruti column being like, they're using these guns, like they're not arcing up their artillery and landing it down. They're just using it like a rifle. It's pointing it and shooting it. And then they start doing the same thing, right? The move from First World War tactics, weapons, and technology to Second World War happens in Spain. It starts at the Battle of Jarama with trench warfare and going over the top and everyone getting shot. And it ends with maneuver warfare, with tanks, with aeroplanes, right? With combined arms warfare. And so if the democratic powers had supported Spain, which I think the Popular Olympics would have had a meaning. The United States came relatively close to boycotting the Berlin Olympics and going to Spain, right? The organizers were so invested, even after the National Olympic Committee elected to go to Berlin. The organizers in Spain were so invested in the struggle of black people for equality in the United States being an anti-fascist struggle, that they were willing to pay, right, for black folks to come over in the United States and compete. And it's in all their propaganda, all their materials saying, yeah, we're working really hard to unite with black folks in the US, bring them over here and make them part of this project. So it presents a vision of a better world, not just a better Olympiad, but like a better way of us relating to each other. And I've always wanted to speak to a Popular Olympian. The last Popular Olympian died in an old folks' home 2 years ago. I wasn't able to visit because of COVID, which is a real bummer. He was an Esperantist, which is another amazing thing that we've completely lost now, right? But like, now anarchists just cancel each other on Twitter, but like back then they were trying to learn Esperanto so that we could all talk to one another, and that it would break down these barriers between the working people of the world. So he was an Esperantist translator at the Popular Olympics, right? The idea that it would be this bridge language, so anyone could go through an Esperantist and at least get a translation through 2 steps. And he died an Esperantist. He practiced Esperanto his whole life. That was how I was able to reach out through Esperanto circles. And like, it's deeply sad that we lost that dream in that moment. And who knows how it would have played out, of course, but at that moment, I think it presented a really appealing vision of a different world.
Mm. This is unrelated, but I haven't heard Esperanto in a while. I used to be conversational when I was a teenager. It's nice to have it up here. Yeah, it's a bummer about the last Olympiad. At the very least, would have been, I'm sure, an interesting conversation. Yeah, Aiden, I know you wanted to.
I mean, it's clear that you could probably go on for hours and hours more with all of these little anecdotes and histories. And I really appreciate you kind of outlining the sort of long and rich history for us here. I was curious, sort of given what you've already told us about the very problematic history of the Olympics and the sort of direct links between what they came up with in Berlin and what we're still doing today, what we're still seeing today as part of these kind of central elements of the ceremony, the torch bearing. I think that's a really fascinating and illuminating demonstration of like what the history of the games are still today, and that there's no amount of sort of conversation. That's not something I'd ever heard of before. That is like literally coming out of Nazi Germany. Um, I think that's really important for people to understand the symbolism there. And sort of on the flip side, the sort of dream vision of the popular Olympics. I mean, if only that could have happened. It sounds so amazing, so beautiful. I wish something like that would happen today as well. And I'm just curious, more broadly, if you could share your thoughts, given that the Paris Olympics are happening very soon and sort of on everybody's mind, or like on mainstream media minds, will be taking up a lot of space in what people are hearing about, like just how broadly the legacy of that sort of problematic history continues into today, and like, should we still be doing this? Is there any sort of redeeming quality to the Olympics as they are? Is there hope or reason to do it differently? Should we try reviving an anti-fascist Olympics? Or is it something that we should kind of be just boycotting altogether, saying like, let's stop doing this. There's nothing here for us, etc.
Yeah, it's a powerful ideal, right? I think in a way the World Cup has taken over, as Elia was saying, as like the global sporting event, right? But it's still a powerful ideal that anyone from anywhere can come together and compete, and we can see who's fastest, but hopefully also learn that we share more than we differ on. As I look at the Olympics right now, George Orwell said sport was war without the shooting. And like, that's what we're doing at the Olympics, right? When we tabulate the states and which state has overcome the other states in the medal table, like, it's really hard to not see eugenic elements there. It's really hard not to see this interstate conflict element there. Despite their sort of strange rules on the size of logos and stuff, the Olympics is entirely about capitalism, right? Like, every major corporation that you can think of has a stake in the Olympics now, right? From Coca-Cola to Samsung to and the absolutely insane trademark enforcement that comes with that. I think it's extremely problematic. Like, I have every year I have friends. Every 4 years I have friends at the Olympics, and I understand their goal to just see how great they can be. And it's also been a platform for amazing things, right? We don't have to go back far. 1968, right? Smith and Carlos on the podium doing the raised fist, right? It's a global platform, and there are not that many times when the whole world is watching the same thing anymore. And so that does give a chance, right? It does give. I had a lot of conversations with friends before Beijing. That was when I was more actively competing, about what it meant to go to Beijing, both in terms of the statements that you could make as a person who might not entirely be aligned with the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party, and in terms of the long-term consequences on your lungs because of the pollution there is so bad. And then what that meant for people who have to live their entire lives there. You just go there and race your bike, right? So it's not something I would say I support, but it's something that I can understand, certainly from the athlete's perspective. But I think there is real benefit in trying to revive some of these popular sporting traditions, right? They explicitly sought in Catalonia as a Popular Front project from 1931 to 1936 to empower women, to bring people of different classes, ethnicities together. And sport still offers that. Like, sometimes I like to go to the Y, and like, I'll go to the Y with some friends for whom it might be that it's one of the most diverse spaces that they enter, right? They have certain types of jobs and they live in certain neighborhoods and they're generally better off than me and they enjoy a more bourgeois existence. They don't encounter diverse spaces, and sport allows us to play together and be on the same team. And I think that's really important. And I think in a world where we interact kind of on these like little tiny micro interactions on social media a lot, getting together and playing together has so much benefit. And so I'm always, maybe I have a slightly romantic view of it, but like to me, it represented the best in anti-fascism, like not just as a project against things, but also as a project for things, right? Saying like we are opposed to the like this racial hierarchy that fascism is trying to create with its medals table. Like we will all play together. We are not here to prove the superiority of one race. We're here to prove the unity of all these races against your hateful project. We refute the idea that women are incapable of running more than 200 meters, which was what they could run in 1936 in Berlin. We will let them run further if they want to, right? We want young working class people to swim because it's a huge problem that working class children drown, right? This isn't just about like who can be the best. It's about making working people healthy, strong, and united. And I think like we still have a giant problem with people drowning in this country, right? Specifically people who are from less privileged socioeconomic groups, right? We are nearly 100 years after anarchists started teaching children to swim. And we still don't execute that. And I think we shouldn't cede the terrain of sport to nationalism, to fascism, to those ideologies of the state, right? It's fun, but it's also powerful. And like when I think about some of the recently I was in north and east Syria, right? And I was playing football with some little kids, right? My fixer was filtering fuel for her vehicle because the quality of the fuel isn't very good there and it'll destroy your engine. And so I was outside with some little kids playing football, and like it's one of the few things, you know, my Arabic is shit, my Comanche is extremely basic, right? I kind of learned Comanche by some dude walking around the market and pointing at things and screaming nouns at me until I could repeat them. And so like the football was the only thing I shared with those kids. We had a meaningful connection, right? And like I've had my ass kicked by 8-year-olds at football in every continent apart from Antarctica, right? And like, but it's a powerful coming together, like that we don't get anywhere else, really. It's a shared terrain, and we should contest it. We shouldn't cede it, I think. And that's up to people who aren't me to decide what that means and how we do it. But I don't think we should just cede that terrain because it's powerful and it's a way of coming together that we ought not to ignore. Even if we're not people who enjoy sports ourselves, I think and it doesn't have to be sports, right? You can do chess. You know, you can do all these things that just represent unity that we sometimes lack now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the piece that you were talking about with just all of the logistics that they were arranging around the Popular Olympics, the way that they were going around and asking people if they had a spare room, that piece of care, and you know, making sure that Black athletes from the U.S. could make it over to Spain and paying for them to get there. I mean, all of those pieces show possibility for gathering, which is really important, right? And being together and celebrating together. And yeah, I just really, really appreciate this take of like we can use, like we don't just have to like give sports to the fascists and to the empire, right? It can be a really powerful way to be together and to find joy and play and unity. And I mean, that doesn't even necessarily have to be just like, oh, you know, an anarchist or anti-fascist project. I mean, like you were saying earlier, Elia, this is something that you can share with family members who you might not otherwise have things to talk about with. I think that's such a beautiful and unifying factor of sports. And I want us to be able to reclaim that and not let them just have it. So thank you for all that.
Just to add a few thoughts on that. The reason I also mentioned the example of the like my father-in-law is that there is a sense I used to think like that, and like I'm not judging anyone who still does, but that certain topics of conversation are like beneath us or not important or you know whatever. And sports sometimes gets that reputation. And I do, and this is like after reading a gazillion books by Bell Hooks and Co. Do believe, like strongly believe that like meeting people where they are is not just something like, oh, I'm debasing myself or whatever, me the high profile academic or whatever the fuck, but actually just understanding that this is how praxis, in my opinion, would work, or at least this is how my activism, let's say to use a simple word, would work. And it does lead. I mean, I have been in situations where it can be an icebreaker. It can be something like, it's just a thing in common. And as as James pointed out, the Olympics and much more so as well, like the World Cup is among the very, very few times when like at least a lot of human beings, most I don't know, but like a lot of human beings are, either sitting down in front of the TV or going to the fan zones, which are dynamics in and of themselves, to watch something, and they have their focus on something for a period of time, and that can be very transformative. That can be very powerful. It can also be the exact opposite. It can be transformative in a negative sense. Obviously, it can be a way for corporations to sports wash. It can be all of those things, and much worse. Obviously, the Euro has is sponsored by the most recent one by the Qatar tourism agency, for example. Visit Qatar.com. It was written everywhere on all of the matches, and the one before it or the one before that one, I don't remember, was sponsored by the Azerbaijani oil estate company. And the Africa Cup, if I'm not mistaken, is still sponsored entirely, basically, by Total, as in the French petroleum company. And so, they have those folks, the powerful folks, lobbies, corporations, governments, etc., have understood that this is a very useful platform for them. There's a reason why Bahrain is so into Formula One. It's not because the average Bahraini suddenly woke up one day and was into cars. There was a political calculation by the government, obviously, among other examples. But that's one which I worked on. I wrote a report on that some years ago now. So it's something, and I'll just briefly mention like Musa Okwonga. I had a podcast with Musa Okwonga, Justin Salhani, and Fabian Goa before the World Cup and after the World Cup. Before the World Cup was kind of to talk about all of the problems associated with it. After the World Cup was, well, partly on that as well, but also on kind of reflecting what it meant and what are certain things that, for example, Qatar got away with, what are other things that Qatar maybe did not get away with, and so on and so forth. And, just to paraphrase, well, James as well and Aiden as well, like just I don't think the solution is to cede grounds, essentially. And I still have difficulties watching any football match that is, a big international event or whatever, like the World Cup final, the Euro final or whatever, because there's so much corruption at every stage of the process, before the match, even more so, obviously. But all of the as I mentioned, the advertisers on the match itself, what gets chosen, when they even choose to stop. I've noticed that more and more. They start, like, if there's a goal and it's a very particularly important goal and they want to kind of make you rewatch it or invite you to rewatch it after the match, they will first introduce a few ads because they know that you're going to sit around and watch it. So all of these things have been, in my opinion, kind of ruining the game more and more and more. It doesn't mean that I don't still believe that there is a way to not just enjoy it as kind of this passive consumer thing, but to participate in it in many ways. And, there are football clubs that do that. There are football, the ultras and whatnot, and in various football clubs that have that exact culture, essentially an activist culture to them. St. Pauli comes to mind, although there's some problematic stuff in others. And it's important to recognize it for what it is, essentially. It is a ground, in some sense, a battleground, and for many historical reasons, it's quite literally that, although in different under a different format, and it's worth participating in it if that's something that people feel that is worth their time. Obviously, I'm not going to say everyone do that, but yeah. We are gonna wrap up slowly because we can do this for hours, and there's so much more that we can say, but it's okay. I will do one day maybe something on the specific legacy of the World Cup in Lebanon because it's so weird and often fucked up in very Lebanese ways, but it's for another time. Any closing thoughts from the both of you? And of course, James and Aiden as well. Like, please tell folks where they can follow you online, upcoming projects, whatever you want to share, please feel free to do so.
I think, I know, I'm just like, obviously yesterday was the Euro final. For those of us who do follow football, soccer, I thought like I gave a pretty good example, right? Like seeing these two, like Lamine Yamal and Nico Williams, right? Like suddenly at least Yamal sort of does this thing where he does his zip code, or I think it's his phone extension, right? Like to represent this very like impoverished area of Catalonia where he comes from. And I thought that gives a really good example of how like it gives something about the inherent, like it's hard to deny that the people's talent, and so that allows them sometimes to use this as a terrain to contest. I think that's something we should support. But yeah, just wrapping up. If you want to follow me online, it's James Stout like the beer, James like Bond, on X, formerly known as Twitter. I have a Patreon. You can find all of my stuff on jamesstout.net. The book, like I don't make any money when anyone buys my book. It's an academic book and it's insanely expensive. If you want to read it, just go to the library and ask for it. I would like it if you did that, and it shouldn't cost you any money that way, which is fine by me. And then more libraries will have it and more people can read it, which is why we write books in the first place. But all the information about that is on my website as well. And yeah, just like go outside and play with people. I promise you it will improve your mood. Go and play football with some kids. Like go and go for a run, go for a walk. It's something that we should embrace, and we should not, like I said, we shouldn't cede that terrain. We shouldn't feel guilty for doing it. It's part of humanity. People have played for as long as there have been people. So yeah, keep doing that.
Thanks, James. Yeah, no closing thoughts for me. I think I shared pretty much everything, all the reflections I had. Go listen to all of the podcasts, the other podcast episodes that James has done about this. If you want to learn more, there's so much more to learn, and read James's book. It's great.
I should plug the other podcast I work for. I always forget.
Go for it.
I work for It Could Happen Here, which is a podcast on the Cool Zone Media Network. Go listen to it. If you're only going to listen to one episode, I would love it if you listened to our series called Myanmar Building the Revolution, where we went to Burma and met young guerrillas who are fighting for freedom from a very oppressive fascist project there. And yeah, the world doesn't pay enough attention to them, and their cause means a great deal to me. So yeah, listen to that if you want to listen to some podcast.
I thought for a second that you were going to recommend that episode you did on goats.
Sheep, not goats.
Yeah, you're right.
Slander. Yeah. If you're going to listen to the second episode, the sheep episode is...
that was a genuinely a good one. I said goats.
I won't say where, but I was speaking to some state intelligence agents when crossing a border. They asked me about sheep. Look at you, the guy who did the sheep podcast. And yeah, it was a real moment of reflection upon my life.
A true claim to fame.
Yeah, you're using that PhD.
Love it.
No, but I do also recommend the Myanmar ones. I was semi-joking about the sheep one, although it was quite good as well. Yeah. Anyway,
interested in sports and many other things. Yeah. Thank you so much, James. I am not followable personally online, but if anybody wants to follow Antidote Zine, we are on Mastodon. You can find us on there, and just our website, antidotezine.com. And we also do transcripts for the Fire These Times. So if you are a transcript nerd and like to sit and listen to people talk and take all the ums and ers out of the conversation, that is something that you can hit us up about, and you can find more information on the About page on our website. Thank you for the lovely conversation, and appreciate you having me here for it as well.
Yeah, thank you both for this. This has been another episode of The Fire These Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Thank you for listening, and take care, everyone.